The brutal death of Charles Stoddart, eaten alive by bugs. History is full of examples of people who were simply pawns in a much greater chess game. Charles Stoddart is one such pawn, and met a gruesome fate while serving Britain during its geopolitical struggle with the Russian Empire. During the 19th century, frankly, Britain and Russia hated each other. Why? Well, starting from 1820, Russophobia was all the rage among elite British tea drinkers. They were afraid that the Russians could threaten their precious jewel of India. Also, Russia could destabilize the sick man of Europe, the Ottomans, and the British didn't want that. In the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, the Brits, French, and the Ottomans ganged up on the Russians and defeated them. Thus, the stage was set for the so-called Great Game between the Brits and the Russians, the 19th century version of the Cold War. The main difference being no nukes were involved, so there was a real possibility of war. War didn't nearly come during the Panjshir incident of 1885, when the Russians got a tad too close to India. Anyway, when two titans collide, small fry are bound to be harmed as well. Into this lovey-dovey world arrives Charles Stoddart. Now, Stoddart was born in 1806 and entered the British Army in 1823. In 1838, as a colonel, he was sent on a mission to persuade the Emir of Bukhara to free Russian slaves and sign a treaty of friendship with Britain's East India Company. Little Charlie was probably excited to see these remote and exotic lands, now in present-day Uzbekistan. Unfortunately for the British East India Company, and especially for Colonel Stoddart, he offended Nasrullah Khan constantly from the moment he arrived. In Bukhara, it was customary for visiting dignitaries to dismount, lead their horses into the square, or leave them with servants outside and bow before the emir. Stoddart instead followed British military protocol, which called on him to remain seated on his horse and salute the emir from the saddle. Nasrullah Khan reportedly stared pointedly at Stoddart for some time after the salute and then stalked off without a word. Ever the supremely self-confident representative of imperial Britain, Colonel Stoddart continued to commit gaffe after gaffe after gaffe during his audiences with the emir. Khan Nasrullah, Emir of Bukhara, was also irked when he saw that Stoddart bore no presence, and so finally, with his dignity compromised, he tossed the poor Brit into the bug pit. Did I mention this emir was a sadist and a man-child? Imagine if you went as a tourist to France, you got tossed in a torture chamber for not speaking French. That sounds like the plot of some B-flick horror movie. The pit was about as pleasant as one would expect. Accounts vary as to the exact size of the pit. Reports describe a stony chasm somewhere between 12 and 40 feet deep. Some versions have the pit open for inspection, others cite the sole entrance as a hole in the ceiling through which horse manure and the occasional rope were dropped. Apparently, the manure attracted vermin and further demoralized the prisoner, as if literally flesh-eating bugs wasn't enough. What is known for certain is that the pit was filled with quote-unquote vermin. Rats were part of the mix, but mostly it was just a big hole filled with insects. Stoddart served the next 2 years of solitary confinement in the bug pit. However, Stoddart wouldn't be making like 19th century James Bond and escaping in an implausible fashion. The incredibly unlucky man was forced to endure this horrific treatment for most of the next 2 years. I really don't want to imagine that. Months and months went by, and despite the desperate notes that Stoddart's accomplices smuggled out of the pit for him, notes that made their way to Stoddart's colleagues in India as well as his family in England, no sign of a rescue appeared. Finally, one day, the city's official executioner climbed down into the pit with orders to behead Stoddart on the spot unless he converted to Islam. In desperation, Stoddart agreed. Pleasantly surprised by this concession, the emir had Stoddart brought out of the pit and placed into a much more comfortable home arrest in the chief of police's home. You would have to recall that literally anything will be an improvement to being eaten by bugs. During this period, Stoddart met with the emir on several occasions, and Nasrullah Khan began to consider allying himself with the British against the Russians. Still, no one came to help Stoddart. Busy propping up an unpopular puppet ruler in Afghanistan, the British East India Company had neither the troops nor the will to launch a military force into Bukhara and rescue Colonel Stoddart. The Home Government in London also had no attention to spare a lone imprisoned emissary, since it was embroiled in the First Opium War against Qing China. I guess drugging other countries is more important than rescuing your own men. It looked like all hope was lost and Stoddart would die a forgotten man whose biggest claim to fame had been literally being feasted on by bugs, when in 1841 a British captain named Arthur Connolly trekked east to rescue Stoddart. Connolly was a bit of a big shot in the writer-adventure circles of victorious British Empire. Perhaps he fancied himself as an Indiana Jones. Other sources say that he was depressed at being rejected by his sweetheart, So maybe he was on a suicide mission? Connolly brought many gifts to warm the ice-cold heart of the Emir of Bukhara, and thus Stoddart was released from his horrible torture. Which is what I would like to say. Unfortunately, as the title of this video implies, Stoddart would never leave Bukhara at this point. Now, Connolly was a bit reckless, charging alone into the nefarious Emir's kingdom. A year earlier, he had set out for Khiva on a mission to convince the Khan there to stop trading slaves. Trade in Russian captives gave St. Petersburg a potential excuse for conquering the Khanate, which would disadvantage the British. The Khan received Connolly politely, but was not interested in his message. Connolly moved on to Kokand, with the same result. While there, he received a letter from Stoddart, who was just under house arrest at that particular time, stating that the Emir of Bukhara was interested in Connolly's message. Neither Brit knew that Nasrullah Khan was really using Stoddart to lay a trap for Connolly. Despite a warning from the Khan of Kokand about his treacherous neighbor, Connolly set out to try and free Stoddart. Connolly committed the classic imperialist blunder, ignoring the advice of natives and underestimating their danger. Connolly planned to win his comrades' freedom, placate the Emir, and then unite the Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand under British influence. Nothing much. The Emir of Bukhara initially treated Connolly well, although the BEI captain was shocked at the emaciated and haggard appearance of his fellow countryman, Colonel Stoddart. When Nasrullah Khan realized, however, that Connolly did not bring a reply from Queen Victoria to his own earlier letter, he grew enraged. The British situation grew even more dire after January 5, 1842, when Afghan militants massacred the BEI's Kabul garrison during the First Anglo-Afghan War. Just one British doctor escaped death or capture, returning to India to tell the story. Nasrullah immediately lost all interest in aligning Bukhara with the British. He tossed Stoddart and Connolly into a prison. A regular cell this time, though, rather than the pit. I guess the insects had eaten up their fill already. By the time they were hauled up into the sunlight, their bodies were covered with sores, their hair, beard, and clothes alive with lice. On June 17, 1842, Nasrullah Khan ordered Stoddart and Connolly brought to the square in front of the Ark fortress. The crowd stood quietly while the two men dug their own graves. Then, their hands were tied behind them, and the executioner forced them to kneel. Colonel Stoddart called out that the Emir was a tyrant. The executioner sliced off his head before a cheering crowd. The executioner offered Connolly the chance to convert to Islam in order to save his own life, but the evangelical Connolly refused. He too was beheaded. Stoddart was 36 years old. Connolly was 34. When word of Stoddart and Connolly's fate reached the British press, it rushed to lionize the men. The papers praised Stoddart for his sense of honor and duty, as well as his fiery temper. Hardly a recommendation for diplomatic work, however, and emphasized Connolly's deeply held Christian faith. Outraged that the ruler of an obscure Central Asian city-state would dare execute the sons of the British Empire, the public called for a punitive mission against Bukhara. But the military and political authorities had no interest in such a move. The two officers' deaths went unavenged. In the longer term, the British lack of interest in pushing their line of control into what is now Uzbekistan had a profound effect on the history of Central Asia. For the next 40 years, Russia subdued the entire area that is now Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Central Asia would remain under Russian control until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. I guess the key takeaway from this sad tale is that, first of all, bugs are really creepy. I read some Reddit post somewhere that bugs could quickly kill us all if they gained sentience and decided to just kill us because of how much they outnumber us. Secondly, in the long arc of history, no government really cares to save two common citizens if it doesn't affect them. In the long run, Stoddart and Connolly were executed by a deranged emir in the middle of nowhere for no reason. Deaths are only avenged when they serve a political cause, and in this case, when there was no benefit to be had, the British simply didn't waste resources trying to retaliate. Anyway, I know it's a bit depressing, but I hope you enjoyed this nearly forgotten tidbit from history. Seems like some crazy concoction from a modern anti-imperialist author with a fancy of Brits being slaughtered rather than an actual episode from history. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more great content. This is Scholar of the World, signing out.